They called it love, but the water always whispered the truth. 3 brides, 3 bathtubs, 1 man with a secret, and a trail of loss hidden beneath the surface. This is the story of George Joseph Smith and the brides who never saw their wedding days turn into forever. George Joseph Smith knew how to win trust. Born in 1872 in London, he was polished, persuasive, and dangerous, though no one knew it at the time. Behind his kind eyes and confident smile was a man who moved from town to town under different names, seeking out women who were vulnerable and ready to believe in love. He promised forever, but his intentions were far from faithful. In July 1912, 33-year-old Bessie Monday became his wife, or so she thought. He introduced himself as Henry Williams, and they settled in the quiet town of Henry Bay. 5 months later, tragedy struck. Bessie was found unresponsive in the bathtub. Her husband said she suffered from seizures. The death was ruled accidental. No postpartum, no further investigation. But just days later, he collected on her life insurance and left town. A year later, in 1913, Smith married again. This time, it was 25-year-old Alice Burnham, and he called himself George Love. Weeks after their marriage, Alice, too, was found lifeless in the tub. Same kind of home, same story, same cause listed on the death certificate. Another woman lost, another payment claimed, and again, he vanished. Still, no one asked the question, why does this keep happening? December 1914. George married Margaret Lofty, age 38, under the name John Lloyd. The very next day, Margaret's life ended, under circumstances identical to the others. But this time, someone noticed. A clerk read about the case and recognized it from a past incident. Too many similarities. Same tragic ending. Same man. Just a different name. He reported the connection, and with that, the investigation began. Detective Inspector Arthur Neal of Scotland Yard was handed the case. He combed through marriage records and death certificates, building a chilling timeline of deception. 3 women, all newly married, all passed away in rented homes shortly after their weddings, all under different versions of the same man. It wasn't just coincidence, it was a pattern. But the question remained, how could these women pass away in nearly identical ways without leaving a single sign of distress? That's where forensic expert Bernard Spilsbury came in. Using identical bathtubs and women similar in size to the victims, Spilsbury recreated the scene, safely with live participants and strict control. What he found was terrifyingly simple. If someone was seated in the tub and unexpectedly pulled backward by the ankles, the shock could cause the person to inhale water instantly. Panic would set in, with no struggle marks, just silence. It was the perfect crime. Until now. Armed with new evidence and proof of multiple aliases, police arrested George Joseph Smith in 1915. He denied everything. Denied the names, denied the marriages, denied the women. But paperwork, witnesses, and a trail of financial gain painted a very different picture. Smith stood trial in June 1915 at the Old Bailey. Though officially charged in connection with just one case, the prosecution introduced the other two incidents to show a consistent method and motive. This was groundbreaking and controversial. It was the first time British courts allowed pattern-based evidence to help convict someone. Spilsbury bathtub demonstration became the cornerstone of the case. Letters, documents, receipts, and rental records all connected Smith to each woman and each tragedy. It didn't take long. After just 20 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. George Joseph Smith was found guilty and sentenced accordingly. His actions had finally caught up to him. He never omitted anything, but history would not forget his name. The brides in the bathtub case didn't just capture public attention. It rewrote the rulebook for how investigators and courts handled suspicious deaths. For starters, it was one of the first times forensic experimentation played a central role in solving a case. Bernard Spilsbury's bathtub demonstrations weren't just dramatic, they were revolutionary. Up until then, forensic science was limited, often based on visible injuries or witness statements. But this case proved that death could come without bruises, without blood, and still be criminal. Spilsbury showed that physical evidence, even the absence of trauma, could still tell a story. His scientific method became a gold standard, and it set the tone for what would become modern forensic pathology. But it wasn't just forensics that changed. The trial also broke legal ground. For the first time in British history, the court allowed what's called similar fact evidence. That means a suspect's past behavior, if it follows a clear, consistent pattern, can be presented in a case even if they're not on trial for those exact past actions. Until then, each trial stood alone, but this case showed that a pattern could be just as telling as fingerprints. George Smith's use of multiple names, identical tactics, and repeat tragedies created a profile that couldn't be ignored, and courts began to understand that context matters, especially when lives are at stake. The impact? Investigators across the world began reviewing so-called accidental deaths more critically. Insurance companies tightened their protocols, and newlywed deaths were no longer just sad stories. They became red flags. The brides in the bathtub weren't just victims. They were the catalyst for change. Women whose stories shaped science, strengthened justice, and reminded the world that silence doesn't always mean safety. Smith's story inspired books, films, and TV shows, but more importantly, it became required reading in criminal law and forensic courses around the world. His crimes taught authorities how to use forensics to prove how someone died, use witness accounts to prove why, and use consistent behavior across cases to prove who. The brides in the bathtub case didn't just end with Smith's execution. It became a case study in how to stop the next Smith before he even strikes. Smith's case is referenced in criminology as a milestone in behavioral pattern recognition. Though profiling wouldn't become formalized until decades later, Smith's series of identical murders laid the foundation. Investigators learned that connecting unusual patterns across locations could identify a serial offender. Smith is often referenced in lectures and textbooks when discussing how law enforcement evolved from case-by-case thinking to pattern-based investigation. Smith's murders inspired multiple films, radio plays, true crime books, and even fictional adaptations. The 1940s film Daughter of Darkness and the novel The Brides in the Bath drew direct inspiration from the case. His story regularly appears in true crime documentaries and even in modern podcasts. His name may not be household anymore, but in the true crime and forensic world, he's still a chilling reference point. Smith's legacy lives on not because of who he was, but because of how investigators, doctors, and legal systems responded. He changed the game for forensic medicine, courtroom evidence, and criminal investigation. Over a century later, his crimes are still teaching us how to recognize evil hidden in plain sight. Bessie Monday, also known as Caroline Beatrice Bessie Monday, she was 33 years old when she died. She had married Smith under the alias Henry Williams in 1910. Bessie was the daughter of a clergyman and came from a respectable middle-class background. She inherited a small fortune after her father's death. In 1912, just 2 years into their marriage, she was found dead in the bathtub of a boarding house in Henry Bay. Her will had recently been updated to leave all assets to her husband. Alice Burnham, aged 25 when she died, she was married to Smith under the alias John Lloyd. Alice was a young, trusting woman who believed she found love. Just 3 weeks after their wedding, Alice was found dead in a tub at Blackpool boarding house in December 1913. The attending doctor thought her death was unusual, but there was no clear evidence of foul play at the time. Smith benefited from her death through a life insurance policy he had taken out shortly before. Margaret Lofty, age 38 when she died, she was married to Smith under the alias John Lloyd, and yes, that's the same name he used for Alice. Margaret was quiet, somewhat lonely woman. She had recently inherited money and wanted a fresh start in life. She died the very next day after the wedding in a rented home in Highgate, London. Smith claimed she had fainted while bathing. A neighbor recalled Smith sending him to fetch a doctor, but not until after he made sure Margaret was declared dead. 3 women, 3 homes, 3 promises that were never meant to last. George Joseph Smith used charm to disarm, but in the end, it was the quiet drip of water and the echo of repetition that exposed him. And for the brides in the bathtub, their stories were finally heard.